So what we need to know about critical race theory, why CRT leads us away from Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision for America. That's what we're going to be looking at here tonight, all right? And so maybe some of you like me, you hadn't heard of critical race theory until maybe about a year ago. It showed up on your radar, all right? And we can see here from this graph or this diagram that I have that a lot of states are trying to ban it and do different things. And so it's definitely something that should be on our radar with what's going on in our country, okay? And so the media has jumped to defend critical race theory. There's been a couple of defenses that they've thrown around that I've seen. One of them is the only place CRT is taught is in law school. It's not taught in high schools. It's not taught anywhere else. It's just this idea that they talk about in colleges, okay? The people you're criticizing aren't critical race theorists, all right? So that's a defense you hear a lot. You can't even define critical race theory. That's one I saw with Mark Lamont Hill. And then on Comedy Central with Trevor Noah, he's talking about critical race theory is just teaching about slavery in school. And so what I want us to do is assess a lot of these defenses that the media's been putting out there. Are these true? Or is there more to critical race theory than what the media is telling us? Okay? So like I said, it's new on our radar, but this is not a new idea. Critical race theory was born in 1989. I was 4 years old at the time. It was the same time that the Game Boy came out. It's the same time that the internet was created. And at the same time, there was a group of critical race theorists that were getting together in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, to talk about it. They had their first workshop at that time, all right? So that long ago, they've been talking about this, okay? We're gonna be looking at primary sources, okay? I don't want to be just looking at what Fox News is telling us or any other conservative outlet or anybody else. Let's go to the primary source, okay? So Richard Delgado is one of those sources that I've pulled a lot of information from, all right? He is a critical race theorist. He is one of the fathers of critical race theory. Him and Derek Bell, a Yale law professor, they are the fathers of critical race theory, all right? So he teaches courses on race and civil rights at the University of Alabama and is considered to be one of the founders of critical race theory. So in this book, Critical Race Theory, which I've read a good chunk of it, it's pretty interesting, and we're going to go over a bunch of the material, but it's 200 pages long and contains 0 footnotes or references, all right? So how scholarly can it be? That's just one little tidbit there to get us started. Okay. So where did CRT come from? Richard Delgado tells us on page 5 of his book. He says, critical race theory builds on the insights of 2 previous movements, critical legal studies and radical feminism. That's where he's saying that it comes from. So here's this diagram I put together here. It shows critical race theory up top, all right? And then we have all these other studies here, post-colonial studies, critical pedagogy, critical legal studies, radical feminism. And what he's saying is that critical race theory branched off of these 2 studies here, critical legal studies and radical feminism, all right? But look, we can go even farther than that. To all of these came from critical theory, and critical theory came from the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School came from Marxism, all right? So that's the evolution of these things, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I want us to look at critical theory. What is critical theory? It's the grandfather of all these different studies and disciplines that we're seeing. So what is it? Critical theory seeks to understand human relationships through the fundamental lens of power. So it's a worldview. It's a worldview, right? And so that's what critical race theory does, is they see racism in everything. It's a lens that you use to evaluate the world, all right? So we're going to look now at the 4 tenets of critical race theory. Really, what is this? Let's get into the nuts and bolts of critical race theory, all right? So the first one that Richard Delgado gives us is that racism is normal. And this is from page 8 of his book, where he says, racism is ordinary, not aberrational, normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. So it's normal. So let's ask a question. Is the usual way cops interact with blacks racist? Is that the normal way that society does business? Let's think about somebody else, a teacher, the way that teachers interact with their black students. Are they de facto racist? No, but that is not that is not what this first tenet of CRT is telling us. It's telling us that it's ordinary. It's the normal way society does business, okay? So we see an evolution of this from Robin DiAngelo's book. This is #1 bestseller, mind you. She says, white supremacy is a descriptive and useful term to capture the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white. And the practice is based on this assumption. White supremacy in this context does not refer to individual white people and their individual intentions or actions, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Again, racism is a structure, not an event. All right, so she's expanding the definition of racism. When I was a kid growing up in school, I was taught not to be racist, not to be racist and demeaning to other people of a different skin color, right? That's what I was taught when I was in high school and in elementary school. Ibram X. Kendi, and we'll be talking a little bit about him, he says, when I see racial disparities, I see racism. All right, so whenever blacks are underperforming in society, what he's saying there is it's automatically racist because of this first tenet of critical race theory. All right, so now what does this mean? This means that we can have racism without racists. That's what that means. They've expanded the definition so much that we cannot have one single racist in our country, but because of disparities in society between different groups of people, our society is still racist. So they are currently changing the definition of racism. Okay. So the second tenet of critical race theory is this idea of convergence theory. So let's look at this. Richard Delgado says on page 9 of his book, he says, racism advances the interests of both white elites materially and working class whites psychically. Large segments of society have little incentive to eradicate it. And then on page 48, he says, people believe what benefits them. And he's actually quoting Derek Bell, I believe, right there when he quotes that. Okay. So what does this mean? Okay, for example, Derek Bell's shocking proposal discussed in Chapter 2 that Brown versus Board of Education, considered a great triumph of civil rights litigation, may have resulted more from the self-interest of white elites than from a desire to help blacks. So they passed this legislation. Segregation in public schools ended by a court. What he's saying there is, you know what? The whites that did this, they didn't do it because racism was wrong. They did it because it was going to promote their own self-interest. They did it because it was going to help them, not just help blacks. It was going to actually help them further their career or further something, whatever their motives are, okay? And so here we have Judge Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, this wasn't that long ago, so you guys probably remember this, right? So she adopted 2 children from Haiti. And then Ibram X. Kendi tweeted this. He said, some white colonizers adopted black children, which we would typically say that's a good thing, right? To adopt children from another country that are in need of parents, right? They civilized these savage children in the superior ways of white people while using them as props in their lifelong pictures of denial, while cutting the biological parents of these children out of the picture of humanity. And so you can see here that I underlined that what he's saying, he's calling out their motives. He doesn't know their motives, but he's saying this is their motive, right? They are using these black children from Haiti to, as props in their lifelong pictures of denial. All right, so they are actually racist, and they're in denial, and they're going to prove it to other people, try to prove it to other people by adopting some kids from Haiti. So you can see how the second tenet of critical race theory, which is this idea of convergence theory, is playing itself out in the real world, right? So you can't actually do something to actually help a black neighbor without you doing it in some selfish way. Does that make sense? Okay. Because you're actually doing it to help yourself. All right. Number 3. This is from page 3 of his book. Number 3, questions anti-liberalism. And this is a really important one, all right? Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. So they are questioning the incremental step-by-step process of the civil rights movement, for instance, right? It was incremental. They're questioning equality theory that we're all equal under the law, questioning legal reasoning and Enlightenment rationalism, that laws can actually even be neutral. They don't believe that laws can be neutral. All right? So I want to ask the question, what's fair? What is fair? The concept that we've had up until now is that Lady Justice should have a blindfold over her eyes. So the question we might ask is, should we remove the blindfold from Lady Justice so she can see who she's judging? This is our concept thus far, all right? What's fair? This is the concept that we've believed up until now. You blindfold the judge. And so Leviticus 19:15, where did this idea of blindfolding the judge come from? It comes from the Bible, actually, where it says, do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. All right, so if there's a poor person, don't show favoritism to them. If there's somebody who's rich, well-dressed, who's a great person, they've done a lot of great things, don't show favoritism to them. We are equal underneath of the law, all right? So he says on page 29, Richard Delgado, crits, which are critical race theorists, it's short for critical race theorists, crits are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. Think, in our system, rights are almost always procedural, for example, to a fair process, rather than substantive, for example, to food, housing, or education. Think how that system applauds affording everyone equality of opportunity, but resists programs that assure equality of results, such as affirmative action at an elite college or university, or efforts to equalize public school funding among districts in a region. So we have two contrasting views of justice, right? Equality of opportunity, which is what America has believed in up until now, right? And then now we're talking about equality of outcome. Do we have the same amount of people groups represented with an outcome, okay? You can't have both. You cannot have both. You must choose what kind of justice that you want. And one of them, I would say, is diverging from the biblical concept. Okay. And so here we have an example of what this looks like. Ibram X. Kendi Constitutional Amendment. What is this? To create a new department of the government, which is the Department of Anti-Racism. Raise your hand if you've heard this. No? Okay. All right. So he writes here, I don't know if you can read all that, but I'm just going to read the underlined section here because we don't have enough time. He said what this amendment would do is it would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, or the DOA, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. So what he's talking about here is creating a new branch of government. Not accountable to us, are they? Not accountable to any other politicians. What they are trained experts. A whole branch of government run by bureaucrats that are trained experts that are unaccountable to us. And that what they would do is they would judge whether a law is anti-racist. What does that mean? Does it create disparities? That's what that means. Okay. So he says here, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Is this the kind of country that you want your kids or grandkids to grow up in? Right? Not me. Number 4, the fourth tenet. This is going to be the last one here, okay? He says on page 3, Richard Delgado, knowledge is socially constructed. Minority status brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. The legal storytelling movement urges black and brown writers to recount their experiences with racism and the legal system and to apply their own unique perspectives to assess laws, master narratives. All right, I'll give you another little example here. This is from Tara Yasso. She wrote an article back in 2005 called Whose Culture Has Capital? A Critical Race Theory Discussion of a Community Cultural Wealth. She says, the centrality of experiential knowledge. CRT recognizes that the experiential knowledge of people of color is legitimate, appropriate, and critical to understanding, analyzing, and teaching about racial subordination. So in the past, we used to think that we could reason through these ideas, that we believed in objective truth, where something was true because it was objectively true or not. So this fourth tenet is diverging from that we find the truth by what they would call standpoint epistemology. which is a fancy way of saying, how do we know what's true? That's what epistemology is, the study of what's true, okay? So how do we know what's true? Is it just your perspective? Or are there actually objective standards that we can apply to different ideas to see whether they're true or not? Use our reasoning and rationality to discover whether things are true or not, okay? And I've discovered this. I've done a couple online discussions with people, and I'll share all kinds of data. And then at the end of it, to build some kind of case, I have one person in mind specifically that would say, well, what about the stories? Tell me the stories of people. Like, I've heard all these stories of people. And I've been thinking about this, right? What is data? Data is a whole collection of a whole lot of stories that are put into numbers, but they represent real lives and real people. Stalin is known with saying something like, one person that's killed is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic. And that has a certain amount of truth to it, doesn't it? When people turn into numbers, and there's a whole bunch of them, we kind of lose sight of the atrocity. That's what he's talking about there, right? But let's not lose sight of that. The truth is that statistics actually represent real people with real stories. Okay. So those are the 4 tenets. We've gone over the 4 tenets now. What actually is it? So you should know at this point what critical race theory is. Do you feel, or if you're tracking with me, just kind of raise your hand. Are you kind of following along, or am I losing you? It's okay if I'm losing you. Brian and I will open ourselves up and we'll have an open discussion, okay? And we can clarify some things, hopefully. All right. So let's ask another question. Is CRT confined to law schools? You can see at the beginning of my presentation, Joy Reid was saying, well, NBC's checked it out, and basically we found that it's only taught in law schools. So let's go ahead and see what Richard Delgado says in his own words in his own critical race theory book. This is what he says. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond that discipline. Today, many scholars in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists. All right, and there's a bunch of examples. I'm going to keep moving here quickly. Okay, so CRT contains an activist dimension. All right, he says on page 8, unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. It tries not only to understand our social situation, but to change it, setting out not only to ascertain how society organizes itself along racial lines and hierarchies, but to transform it for the better. So it has activism built right into it as an idea. Okay, I'm going to show this to you. So CRT is designed to not just stay in law schools. The media is not telling us the truth, okay? And so here we have an example. I'll give you a couple examples now of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., all right? They put out some information, some kind of pamphlet about whiteness and white culture, all right? And so here you can actually see a lot of these examples that they put out in this pamphlet, okay? They say that the nuclear family, I'm going to go through, see those arrows. The first arrow, the nuclear family is a father and mother, all right? Objective and rational linear thinking, that is attributed to whiteness in white culture. Hard work is the key to success. Supposedly, that's a white idea. And there's a bunch more up there, and you can see what those are. All right, I'm going to keep trucking here, okay? You can check these out on your own. All right, so the National Education Association. Are you guys familiar with what's going on with the NEA? It's been in the news, okay? And that's one of the things that made me feel like I had to get us all here to talk about this. So let me just look at the bottom there. The National Education Association is the nation's largest professional organization, representing more than 3 million elementary and secondary teachers, a whole bunch of teachers and faculty and that kind of stuff. It's the largest professional organization in the country. They represent 3 million people, all right? And look what they are doing. Look at that first bullet point. Our mission with Ed Justice, this is this program that they're doing, they highlight member voices. That sounds like the 4th tenet, doesn't it? Highlight member voices on social justice and offer resources and tools for activism. They're promoting activism in our schools. Build and grow community of activists committed to advancing social justice policies and public education. Listen, this is serious. We have people in our schools that are promoting activism to teenagers in our schools. All right, let's keep going. Here, the Biden administration, they proposed, and you can see it's in the Federal Register, a whole bunch of stuff. You can see it's referencing Ibram X. Kendi, an anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences. All right, so the Biden administration is trying to push forward anti-racist legislation. Okay, let's keep going. Even in our own state of Ohio, if you care about education in our own state, you can see that they are trying to pass a resolution to condemn racism and to advance equity and opportunity for black students, indigenous peoples, and students of color. And they have done implicit bias training with different staff members and that sort of thing. So even here in our own state, there's this talk going on. So we need to have our ear to the ground and know what's going on, okay? All right, so I want to pivot now a little bit to everything that I've shared with you. Is this worth fighting about? Is this a hill worth dying on? My answer is yes. I think that it is. I'm going to tell you briefly why I think that it is. Number one, history repeats itself. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, there always is this fallacious belief. It would not be the same here. Here such things are impossible. Alas, all the evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. And so we see a lot of these trends in history replaying itself out in our own society now. And I'm trying to say, hey, wake up to what's going on. History is repeating itself. We need to know history so that we can see what's happening in our own society. So you have China's Cultural Revolution. How did it begin? It began with the destruction of the four olds, which is basically tradition and religion and ideas and that sort of thing. All right? The politicization of everything. So in the Soviet Union, you couldn't play chess just for the sake of chess. It had to become political. What do we have going on when we turn on our sports shows and that sort of thing? Yes. Okay, good. There's all kinds of stuff going on in our commercials and everything. It's everywhere now, all right? Everything is becoming political. There's no area of life that is not political. Okay. Lenin said, give me 4 years to teach the children, the seed I have sown will never be uprooted. That's what Lenin said. And what happened in the Soviet Union, okay? We have this narrative of oppressor versus oppressed being played out. It used to be the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Now it's being blacks versus whites. There's all kinds of different identity groups, male, female. They're playing identity politics, all right? This is not a good idea. We've seen what happens in the past, in history, when these ideas play themselves out. And so, look, you can see all the death and destruction. Anywhere that communism, Marxism has gone, millions of people have died, all right? So you can see the numbers up there, all right? 65 million, the People's Republic of China. That's 65 million, all right? In total, 95 million people have died because of communism in the 20th century from these identity politics or all these different ideas that we're talking about, okay? All right, number two, it's a self-refutation of the civil rights movement. So I'm going to briefly go over what did Martin Luther King Jr. stand for. He stood for brotherhood instead of separation, all right? Let me show you. He said, I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. Brotherhood. He said, the marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. I still believe that. That you're my brother, right? We are all brothers and sisters made in the image of God. That is a great idea that we cannot lose. Secondly, he affirmed the American creed and the Judeo-Christian heritage. He said, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That is the American creed. G.K. Chesterton said, America is the only country that was founded upon a creed, not an ethnicity. Name another country out there that's been founded upon an idea. There isn't one. We are the only one. And it's off of this creed right here. That's what we are founded upon. He said, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, were guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. Nonviolence. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Somebody needs to tell Black Lives Matter this, I think. All right? There's been a lot of violence last summer. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. And this is the last one. Just laws are rooted in natural and eternal law. Here's what he said. There are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. This great Western idea that St. Augustine, that Thomas Aquinas came up with, that just laws are based in this eternal law. And what is the eternal law? It is the mind of God. That there is a transcendent law that transcends governments, right? And he is affirming this great Western tradition. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. So whenever whites were passing laws that applied only to blacks, that was unjust. It was not in keeping with the eternal law. He said this is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Another way to say that is equality under the law. He said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The great idea that I think we are losing. It's a competing worldview. I'm going to just briefly go through this, but I think it's important. What are worldviews? They answer big questions. What are human beings? What is wrong with the world? What is our ultimate purpose? How should we live? The Christian worldview, and this is from Neil Shenby, he writes, human beings are created in the image of a good and loving creator. Our primary identity comes from our relationship to him. We have rebelled against God, bringing sin and suffering into the world. God sent Jesus Christ to die on the cross and to be raised from the dead to rescue us from our sin. Our purpose in life is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. We look forward expectantly to the return of Christ when he will gather his church, consummate all things, and establish a new heavens and earth. What does CRT say, the worldview? What is their worldview? We are members of social groups locked in struggle for power. Everything's about power. That's the worldview, right? Everything's about power. Our primary identity comes from our relationship to other groups. It's not a vertical relationship between us and God or some kind of transcendent moral law, if you want to say that, something transcendent above us. Our primary identity comes from, it's horizontal between different people groups, all right? Suffering is caused by systems of oppression. Our purpose in life is to fight against the subjugation of dominant groups so that we can eventually achieve a state of equity. All right, so here's what I believe is at stake. And you can just see I've thrown a whole bunch of things up here. Maybe we can have more of a discussion later about what's at stake. But I am basically done at this time. And we're going to let Brian come up and now share. So thank you for your time.